I welcome everyone for joining us to another installment of the Sustainable Energy Seminar Series. This is your first time. My name is Scott Williams. I'm the Research and Education Coordinator at the Wisconsin Energy Institute. And the Sustainable Energy Seminar is held every other week in the fall and the spring with the goal of highlighting cutting edge energy research from across UW-Madison, and also to showcase how different disciplines are understanding energy challenges and developing solutions. And throughout the series, you'll hear from experts in science and engineering, as well as social sciences and humanities. And our goal is to learn about the different ways in which they view sustainable energy challenges and solutions. The seminar is open to the public, but is also a class for students in the Certificate in Engineering for Energy Sustainability, as well as the Masters in Sustainable Systems Engineering. We will be offering this seminar online for the entire fall semester, and you can sign up for any of the other upcoming seminars on the same registration link that you used for this program. We do have live captioning enabled for anyone who would like to use that feature. You can click on the live transcript button to toggle that feature on or off. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, and if you'd like to ask questions of our speaker today, you can use the Q&A box. The button of that is at the bottom of your screen as well. So our speaker today is Randy Jackson, who is a professor of agronomy at UW-Madison. His research interests are broadly in the structure and function of managed, semi-natural, and natural grassland ecosystems. And this includes topics such as landscape level nutrient exchange, ecosystem level carbon and nutrient cycling, and plant community responses to disturbance. And taken together, these provide the scientific basis for agroecology, farms as ecosystem units, cellulosic biofuel cropping systems, as well as grazing effects on pasture and prairie. So today he'll be talking more about grasslands, especially as it relates to bioenergy and ecosystem health. So welcome.
Thanks so much, Scott. It's nice to be here. Appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the work that has been happening in my lab and and beyond in other folks' labs, especially around the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center over the years and even beyond. So I want to talk today about ecosystem health and how I think that grasslands are a critical part of building ecosystem health. So to motivate things, I just want to say, why bioenergy? And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but certainly there's this notion that from a geopolitical perspective, it would be a good thing for us in the US in particular, to break our dependence on foreign oil. And we could have a semester-long debate about this. In fact, I think I was part of one a couple of years ago, whether or not that really is a good idea and what the ramifications of it might be. Some would argue that it's better to be tangled up with foreign countries, if you will, and that the less tangled up we are with them, that the more likely we are to isolate ourselves and make decisions that aren't for the best of humanity. But I don't want to go down that road too much today. I'd be happy if we had some chatter about that later on if folks wanted to. There is this notion that bioenergy is renewable, and so I want to talk a little bit about that today. And then there's also this notion that bioenergy is good for the environment, and so that's probably the main part of the work that I would find some expertise in, so we can talk about that and at least have some data to share with respect to that. So to that point, one of the big motivations for bioenergy is there's this idea that it will help us combat climate change, that it will help us mitigate climate change. And I would argue that if we do it right, it should also help us adapt to the inevitable climate change that is happening now and in the near term. At the big picture level, the global level that is, we have this atmospheric carbon increase of about 4 petagrams of carbon per year, and that is basically the net result of the difference between the 9 petagrams that we're currently putting into the atmosphere every year through fossil fuel combustion and creation of cement and land use change, and some stimulation of uptake in photosynthesis in both the oceans and on land. So those red numbers there, the +3 and the +2, would be the anthropogenic stimulation of photosynthesis, which is to say carbon uptake by by the biosphere. And so it really is this 4 petagrams of carbon per year that we're trying to crack. And a lot of folks think that we can, that our agricultural systems have a big role to play in this. Just for context here, because I don't know what a petagram is, it's about 1 quadrillion. It's not about, it is 1 quadrillion grams of carbon. So I mentioned that a lot of folks think that we could do something about this with land use change and land use management. And so this figure from Harden et al. In 2017 speaks to this. So again, we're trying to hit that, we're trying to crack that 4 petagram of carbon a year nut. And you can see here that they estimate that globally, improvements in forestry management, improvements in crop management, and improvements in grazing management, all added together, would sum up to, basically come up around 4 petagrams, maybe even more than 4 petagrams of carbon per year. But of course, then we have the ongoing wrong directional change of permafrost thawing, which is adding more carbon to the atmosphere, and human land use change, in particular biomass clearing, tree clearing in the tropics. And those activities are putting us in the wrong direction with respect to changing land use in an effort to fight climate change. Just because, again, I don't really think in petagrams, I tend to think more in these scales that are kind of depicted here with this picture of Greg Sanford here holding some soil. And what I've depicted here is what is about 1 meter squared of land. Greg's holding about 20 grams of soil in his hand. If you look at the amount of forest and crops and grazing land on the planet, one can do some back of the envelope calculations and say, if we're going to meet these kinds of goals, that we need to make gains of roughly 10 to 70 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. So for each meter squared, we need 10 or 70 grams of carbon to be accumulating every year. So for context, here's Greg holding about 20 grams of soil, which is not all carbon. Maybe 2.5% of that soil is carbon if we are in a pretty rich soil. And so about 0.5 gram of what's in Greg's hand there is carbon. And so in order to meet this kind of number, basically we need to add 20 to 140 handfuls like that one Greg has to that meter squared every year. That's a lot of soil to add to that meter squared every year all over the globe. So I just want to give some context for, like, this is a big nut to crack. This is not just like we can tweak some systems and maybe they'll add a bunch of carbon. Again, for context, some estimates of background soil formation that is just from weathering and inputs of organic matter put it at about 1 to 5 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. So that's all for context and part of this big nugget we're trying to crack with bioenergy. I don't want to belabor this too much. I think most folks get that there are so-called first generation bioenergy systems that largely rely on plants and the edible parts of plants. So in other words, the food parts of plants, like sugar beets and sugar cane. I see there's a spelling error there, the corn grain, et cetera. And then there's so-called second generation, sometimes referred to as cellulosic biofuels or bioenergy. And that the benefits of those is that second generation bioenergy is that it relies not on the food part of plants, but on the non-edible part. Third generation would be this algal biomass, which I don't know much about, but there's a lot of energy and interest in helping to develop that. And then some more chemical type approaches here, chemical and physical approaches to fourth generation. So if we break that down then into this first, second, and third generation biofuels, the main point is that we're trying to get to fermentable sugars to help us make liquid transportation fuels, and that there are some significant differences in the steps based on the type of feedstock that you begin with. And in particular, when we talk about cellulosic biofuels coming through this so-called second generation pathway, there's this need for some sort of pre-treatment step that helps break open the fibers, the cell walls and the fibers and the material that makes up plants, in particular the non-edible parts of plants, to expose the component parts of the plant to enzymatic hydrolysis and then eventual fermentation. And so one of the reasons that there's not been a wider adoption of second generation biofuels and bioenergy in general is the cost of the pre-treatment and the cost of the enzymatic hydrolysis. Although I'm not an expert in this part of the science, I seem to have seen quite a few publications that have demonstrated some breakthroughs, particularly from GLBRC, that have indicated that they've overcome some of those cost issues. And that would all lead me to believe that the real bottlenecks on producing second generation biofuels, cellulosic biofuels, is on the production side, and in particular in the social ecological side of things, as opposed to the technology side of things. Again, I'm not an expert in the technology side of things. I'm just going on what I've heard and what I've read, and we could have some more conversation about that later if you like. So as a result of this perceived need to get ourselves off of foreign fuel and to do ourselves a favor environmentally and fight climate change and that sort of thing, the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 helped drive this renewable fuel standard, which helped drive a big change towards first generation bioenergy. So cellulosic, I'm sorry, not cellulosic, non-cellulosic, that is corn-based ethanol exploded really as a result of this policy. And so here's just a indication of where those plants were across the US, with a strong concentration of them in the Corn Belt to take advantage of the corn grain. Again, the first generation biofuels are fermenting the sugars that are from the starch that's in these corn kernels. And so that has been a boon to corn growers in particular. Here is the projection, or the sort of the mandate that came out of that RFS, that renewable fuel standard, that was basically mandating that over time we would blend more and more ethanol into our fuel supply, and that there would be a cap of about 15 billion gallons of first generation biofuel. And as you can see here, that cap is depicted here as a straight line of this, the green part of this, the dark green part of this plot. So these are all projected here on the left. And the cellulosic biofuel was meant to expand at a really dramatic pace over the late teens. Here on the right is what's actually happened. And as you can see, there's just very little cellulosic biofuel production. And lots of arguments and debates in the literature and on the internet about why this is, and why we haven't overwhelmed the technology barriers to produce more cellulosic biofuels, et cetera. But again, I would argue that it's more of a socio-ecological problem. Some people like to call it a chicken and an egg problem. Maybe if there were just people out there growing more of it would happen. One of the big impediments, if you will, and one of the conversations around first generation biofuels is the so-called food versus fuel debate, which is an argument that we should not be using food crops, and in fact that we shouldn't be using land that currently produces food crops for fuel, that there's a moral component to this, that the world is short of food, and that food is limiting to people's health and well-being, and so we shouldn't be using that food or that land that can grow food to produce fuel. All that said, as you can see from this plot here from the Iowa Corn Board, some 27% of all the corn that we grow in the US currently goes to producing ethanol for fuel for our gas tanks. And some 39% of it goes to feed in these various livestock. And in particular, these livestock are generally fed in confinement or feedlot type situations. So 39% of the corn goes there. About 16% of the corn is exported, which is to say sold on a market to countries that are not particularly needy, let's say. They're countries that are willing and able to buy the corn. Japan comes to mind, Mexico comes to mind, other countries in South America come to mind. So the exports aren't going to quote unquote feed the world, as folks might like to have you think. They're being purchased. And then some 9% of it goes to food and industry to largely make sugar and for soft drinks and other foodstuffs. And then there's about 9% residual that does not get used because there's not enough market for it. There's not enough demand for it, either internationally or domestically. So there's been this tremendous supply of corn, so much so that there's a residual on average every year. More corn is supplied than is actually than there's actually demand for. And as some folks have pointed out, that by putting corn in our gas tank, we are helping to displace the amount of foreign oil or oil in general that we rely on, fossil fuel oil that we rely on. But even if we used all of the corn grain to make ethanol in the US, that would only displace about 1 out of every 6 gallons, which is significant, but it wouldn't get us off of fossil fuel oil in particular. So if we keep talking about some of the problems here, as I will here for the next few minutes, about this first generation ethanol, in particular corn-based ethanol, this plot speaks to one of the major problems. And it's a pretty complicated plot, but the takeaway message is the left-hand bar here for corn grain ethanol. Here you see soybean diesel, which is another animal. But corn grain ethanol, here you see, this is the energy that comes out of the system in terms of corn grain ethanol in that dark orange. And then that lighter orange is the dried distillers grains, which are the solid byproduct or what's left over, the residual of the ethanol distillation process, fermentation process. Those dried distiller grains have a lot of energy in them and get used as livestock feed. So they're not a waste product per se. They go to feed livestock in confinement situations. But even with that dried distiller grain component built into it, you can see the amount of energy that it takes to make that corn grain ethanol. If you just look at the ethanol, it's barely a net positive energy gain. If you add in the dried distiller grains, and you get a reasonable energy gain, I guess. But compared to cellulosic ethanol, which I don't have a plot for here, some folks put this ratio, which is here indicated as 1.25, as high as 100 for cellulosic ethanol, because there's so little energy invested in the growing of the crops in particular. I guess that remains to be seen, since it hasn't been done at a full scale in a very significant way. So that's one of the big problems with this first generation type of ethanol production. And my colleague in Minnesota has often said, really, corn grain ethanol is just a way of taking fossil fuels and converting it into ethanol so we can put it in our gas tank, because we use natural gas and oil to do the conversion of the corn grains into sugars. So it's not a particularly high gain type of approach. But it is high gain for politicians, for sure. As Chuck Grassley has once said, there's nothing negative about ethanol. It's good, 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 good. And I think anybody who pays attention to politics knows that the first stop every 4 years on the campaign tours in Iowa. If you want to be the one who puts your neck out and says we should do something different rather than sending, a third or a fourth of our corn grain to ethanol, then you basically disqualify yourself from the political process. And that's because it has been a tremendous boon to the farming community to have this extra use, if you will, or this additional use for the corn grain, this additional demand for corn grain. Notwithstanding the fact that if you look around the upper Midwest, and here's Iowa in this analysis from Brandis et al. In 2016, looking at the profitability of corn production in Iowa, and you can see that in some years, the green here indicates that it is particularly profitable, but then in some years, it's particularly unprofitable in much, if not most, of corn land, of the Corn Belt. And if it's not profitable in a place like central Iowa or in Iowa in general, it's probably not profitable in other places either, where that are generally speaking less productive with respect to corn. Not only are there some places where it's almost never profitable, on average, this is data from the USDA Economic Research Service, on average, corn usually isn't profitable. And so it's not to say that there aren't some producers that are making money at it. They are for sure. But here's the average corn profitability without any government subsidies over the last 26 years or 27 years. And you can see here that if you look at the Northern Crescent region, which is this royal bluish color, there really were only 4 or 5, I think 4 years out of the last 26 that corn was profitable on its own. And that was as a result of that RFS, that renewable fuel standard that spurred on the ethanol boom. So corn is not particularly profitable on its own and requires a significant amount of subsidy from the federal government, billions and billions of dollars is what I mean by significant, in order to keep people in business. In addition to those problems with first generation biofuels and corn biofuels in particular, the fact that these are annual cropping systems, that is, they have to be planted every year and the soil has to get disturbed one way or the other, whether you're no-till or not. When you plant the corn, you disturb the soil. When you harvest the corn, you leave behind a significant amount of bare soil, et cetera. And this is creating devastating soil loss problems. A recent study estimated that about a third of all the topsoil in the United States has been displaced and eroded away from wherever it was to begin with. And it finds its way to low spots. And so it's not like it leaves the agroecosystem altogether. It does in some cases, but a lot of it's just moving from higher places to lower places on the landscape. But a lot of that soil is finding its way into our waterways and with devastating eutrophication effects in the surface waters. And of course, there are heroic efforts to try to fix this system, to try and tweak it by adding cover crops and not tilling the soil. And these measures are all, they all move us in the right direction, but none of them stop the problem. They slow it down. And that's a good thing. And so I don't want to undermine, I don't want to be here to be the one to say, don't do this. But I think we have to find better alternatives than tweaking the system. And as some folks like to say, being less bad. And bad is, frankly, an agriculture that erodes away soils, which undermines future use and future generations. In addition to the soil loss, what leaves with the soil are nutrients. Phosphorus and nitrogen in particular are just devastating our waterways. This is the Yahara River a couple of years ago with blue-green algae choking it. And here's a bull that was scooped out of that river. Lots of dead wildlife as a result of the lack of oxygen as the nutrients come into these waterways. organisms take up those nutrients and they grow to a level that the water body isn't used to, let's say. And as they die, the decomposition of those organisms takes up oxygen that higher trophic level organisms like these fish and other wildlife can't survive in. So it's devastating locally. Here's Lake Mendota and Monona, et cetera, and the Yahara chain of lakes. Here's an algal bloom seen from space. Happens every year, seems to happen most of the summer nowadays. Moves around the lake based on wind patterns. Basically has devastated recreation in the lakes, has undermined their ability to be used to swim and certainly to drink from. And then this problem manifests itself at the continental scale as well, with this devastating dead zone, the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. That is, in some cases, devastated shrimping industries in that part of the world, to the point where there are now efforts in this part of the world, in the upper Midwest, to bring shrimpers and fishers from the Gulf up here to meet farmers, to talk to them about what's happening as a result of all the soil and sediment and nutrients that are coming down the Mississippi River and choking off a fishery that has been one of the most productive fisheries in the world. These problems are worldwide. You can look at every continent and we have these kinds of problems. This just happens to be one of the most obvious for us. I mentioned the inability to swim in local beaches. This is a very popular swimming spot near my house that I get particularly irritated when I can't swim in it. So in addition to those water quality problems, we have devastating not bioenergy, I lost biodiversity. We have devastating biodiversity responses to the way we're doing agriculture. This paper was published in 2019 in Science and looks at bird abundance and diversity and relates that to land use and land management. And the takeaway message here is, for me, that there's this massive decline in the avifauna since 1970. Some 3 billion birds have been lost as a result of the land management that we do in North America. And particularly hard hit are grasslands, which is where we do agriculture. We do agriculture in America's grasslands, in North America's grasslands. The Corn Belt is America's grasslands. Obviously, there are grasslands in the West as well, but you can see here that what's been particularly hard hit in terms of the avifauna has been places where we grow corn and soybeans. So one of the things that we did in the first iteration of the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center, the GLBRC, Tim Meehan was a landscape ecologist that worked in our sustainability efforts. He looked at some scenarios where we use different types, where we promote different types of bioenergy crops. And on the left here is a scenario that's a high input, low diversity scenario. So that is to say, bioenergy crops like corn and corn stover, the leftover stalks from corn. Basically, if we increase corn production in this landscape, what is that likely to do to bird richness, species richness? And you can see here the dark number is worse, and it had pretty devastating effects. On the other hand, Tim explored what would happen if we had a low input, high diversity type of feedstock to produce bioenergy. So cellulosic bioenergy, as I was talking about earlier. And what if we increase that significantly out on the landscape? And as you can see here, the bird diversity and bird numbers basically increased dramatically where we were producing cellulosic bioenergy in a lot of the region. So there are some solutions. I mean, the cellulosic bioenergy, the second generation bioenergy, does offer us some solutions in terms of biodiversity. When we looked at the yields of those bioenergy crops, which Greg Sanford did here, using this bioenergy cropping systems experiment that we built both at Arlington Ag Research Station here in Wisconsin and also at the Kellogg Biological Station in southwestern Michigan. So here's Arlington on the top, and the KBS is the Michigan results. We looked at several different cropping systems, corn, which was being harvested for grain. That's these hatched lines. But then the biomass that was left over after the grain was harvested, which is to say the stover, was also harvested for cellulosic bioenergy. And so you can see when you take that approach, you have a tremendous amount of energy coming out of that system, the grain plus the biomass. Other crops like switchgrass or giant miscanthus, which is a tropical grass, native grasses in combination, and even restored prairie. As you add the sort of native component, if you will, to the grassland, as you diversify the grassland, in general, you're getting waning yields in terms of total biomass production. But our assessment of this was that it's probably worth the trade-off when it comes to the biodiversity responses, the water quality responses, hopefully the soil carbon responses, and I'll talk a little bit more about this here as we move on. And that the differences in yield were not so devastating, you know, between say the restored prairie system and the switchgrasses, that the yield hit wasn't so devastating that you would never promote the use of a diverse restored prairie because of these trade-offs. There was significant biomass to be had even in the restored prairie. These are some other results looking at these extensive sites in GLBRC1, and this is just looking at a range of biodiversity responses to corn, continuous corn, switchgrass, and prairie systems. And so this wasn't from our controlled experiment at Arlington and Michigan, but from a range of sites all around the two states, really. And you know, what you find basically is that there was overall a more responsiveness in terms of the biodiversity metrics, an improvement in biodiversity metrics, higher levels of biodiversity metrics across the perennial grasslands and diverse systems compared to the corn systems, whether we're looking at birds, whether we're looking at arthropods, pollinators, et cetera. We also looked at greenhouse gas emissions and over time at this long-term experiment. And again, the takeaway message here is that we get a significant loss of nitrous oxide, which is a very potent greenhouse gas from our corn system, whether it's at Arlington or at the Kellogg Biological Station. Some 15 to 20 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. So for context, corn, we usually add about 180 on average, at plus or minus 40. We usually add about 180 or so kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. In this continuous corn systems, I'm not showing the data here, nitrate leaching, another loss pathway for nitrogen, typically is on the order of 30 or 40 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. So between that 30 and 40 kilograms and this 15 or 20 kilograms, we're losing almost half, 40% of the nitrogen that we add to the continuous corn. So it really is like putting it on a sieve, into a sieve. We're losing significant amounts of the atmosphere and a significant amount to waterways. And it's not to say we don't lose any with our native prairie systems, with our prairie grasses like switchgrass, et cetera. It's important to note that all of these systems were fertilized with nitrogen except for the restored prairie, which was not. And so these systems actually perform pretty well in that they're losing less than 5 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. Also important to note that atmospheric deposition in this part of the world is roughly 6 to 8 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. So we're really losing, to at least gaseous loss here, about what's coming in through atmospheric deposition. So then I mentioned soil carbon. I just want to talk about this really briefly. I have this little video of Jacob, who works with us, taking a deep core at the Wisconsin Integrated Cropping Systems trial. So the soils here are about a meter deep, and you can see that we've sampled down to about a meter. I don't know how to make this stop. And we then take that meter deep soil core and look at the carbon concentration and the carbon amount, I should say, not just the concentration, but the total carbon that's in one of those core.
And we lost your screen.
Thank you.
Looks good.
Thank you. So we look at the total amount of carbon in these cores. Now, here is from that same bioenergy cropping systems experiment that we talked, that I showed you a minute ago, just in the 0 to 10 centimeters, so really just the very surface soils. A look at the change in carbon from 2008 to 2017. We sampled in 08 and in 13 and in 2017 from all 8 of these systems. And the no-till maize, as you can see, there was no significant change in the surface horizon. The no-till corn and soybean system was losing carbon to the tune of 18 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. Remember at the beginning, I said that in Greg's hand was 20 grams of soil, so about a half a gram of carbon. Here we're losing 18 grams. So, we're definitely going in the wrong direction with respect to trying to accumulate carbon. The switchgrass and the miscanthus were not significant, neither was poplar. The mixture of native grasses, the prairie, and the so-called successional field, which is to just say weeds, we just let it go and let whatever colonize and let it grow and harvest it every year. Those systems were adding a significant amount of carbon in the surface horizon. 25 to 35 grams of soil carbon per meter squared per year. So hooray, that's great. We love gaining carbon. The problem is over that same time period, when we looked at the entire soil profile, the 0 to 80 centimeters, those changes went away, those positive gains in those native systems went away. In fact, there were no longer any significant differences among all the different cropping systems. The only significant trend was an overall trend, which was a negative trend, a loss of about 77 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. And this is very troubling and also similar to results that we've found over time at the Wisconsin Integrated Cropping Systems trial. So what this implies is that when we add in that depth, that from 10 to 80 centimeters, somewhere along the way across that depth, we are losing a significant amount of carbon, enough to overwhelm whatever is being gained in the surface horizon. This has really important ramifications for things like carbon markets, where farmers are going to be incentivized to do particular things to help build carbon. If we're not looking at the entire soil profile, we could be paying farmers to store carbon, and they're doing all the right things and the good things that they're supposed to do to build carbon. But if for some reason we're losing carbon at depth and not capturing that, we're really pushing ourselves in the wrong direction and potentially undermining the whole system with good intention. So we have to look over an entire soil profile to really understand if the system is sequestering carbon or not. And in fact, over this almost 10-year period, it does not look like we were doing that, at least at the Arlington Ag Research Station. I mentioned that Greg found similar results at the Wisconsin Integrated Cropping Systems trial, and these are his results. I won't walk through them. So all that said, there's still a lot of promise, we think, for bioenergy production, in particular when you combine growing crops, these second generation crops with things like carbon capture, where we're actually taking CO2 and locking it up geologically, which I know nothing about. But when we combine that with growing cellulosic crops and whatnot, we seem to get a very positive indication of carbon gain, as depicted here in this paper in Environmental Science and Technology by Ilya Gelfand. And especially if you take into account at both, this is the Kellogg Biological Station in Michigan and our Arlington site on the Mollisol here in southern Wisconsin. If you look across all of these treatments, in general, we have a net gain of energy and a net drawdown of carbon from the atmosphere. This is global warming impact of these different cropping systems. And as you can see here, it's mainly driven by fossil fuel offset credits. So credits that you get for not burning fossil fuels, but rather significantly driven by the ability of the soil, that's the purple here, to actually accumulate carbon. And here, this was before the results actually came out. So we just came up with a literature estimate of what these soils were likely to be gaining. And these soils were predicted to be gaining a significant amount of carbon, basically about 4 or 5 times as much as 4 or 5 times as much as what we see in some pasture systems around the world. So we have cause to be concerned about our ability to actually build carbon in soils with even cellulosic bioenergy crops. So when we talk about healthy agroecosystems and what are they and what do we want them to be, we really want them to be something more like this, where we're getting a full range of ecosystem services provided, not just production, as is depicted over here, where we get a lot of production out of our intensive cropland, but low water quality regulation and low water flow regulation, that is to say a lot of flooding or low biodiversity values, carbon sequestration, et cetera. Hypothetically, there are systems out there like these second generation cellulosic systems that can provide us a more, a fuller complement of ecosystem services. We have to spend more time and energy understanding how those ecosystem services trade off. Here's just another depiction of looking at those ecosystem services in the Yahara River watershed, which a group from the Yahara 2070 project had done in the bioenergy context. This is just to say that there are going to be trade-offs, like the carbon story I just told you that isn't so rosy. In the meantime, we're still getting soil retention, we're still getting nutrient retention, we're still getting biodiversity, and we have to be able to explore what those trade-offs are. And my pea brain isn't enough, you can't keep track of all those things simultaneously. So we have to have what we call decision support tools, models that allow us to do this and allow us to do this in real time. And so one of the most important things that emerged from the first round of the GLBRC was this Smartscape tool that Claudio Graton's group took the lead on developing. And what Smartscape allows us to do is basically look at the landscape and paint it in different ways. That is to say, change the land use in different parts of the in different parts of the landscape, and then ask, what does that do to net income? What does that do to soil carbon? What does that do to phosphorus, nitrogen, et cetera? All these ecosystem services, so that we can look at what the trade-offs are, we can quantify them, and we can, most importantly, sit around the table with stakeholders, with community partners, and explore this state space, explore like what's possible, painting the landscape in different ways. So like this, this example here is the area northwest of Lake Mendota. And in this scenario, I think we queried and asked for all of the land in this part of the region, in this region, all of the land within 500 feet of a riparian area that's growing corn. And that's what the red blotches are there. It's showing us the amount of area, where it is, and then we can transform that area in the safe space and say, what if we put it all in grass and harvest it for bioenergy? what's that going to do to profit? What's that going to do to all these other ecosystem services? We need to do that with some real strong transdisciplinary approaches. Transdisciplinarity, in my mind, is not just interdisciplinary across academic silos, but that plus cross-sector engagement with folks from outside of academia. And we all need to be able to sit around with these tools, farmers, agency folks, extension, industry folks. We need to be able to turn the dials on these models like these fellows are doing here in this picture. And like I say, painting the landscape in different ways and seeing how things trade off. And eventually converging on some sort of community-driven landscape design, because there are going to be trade-offs. Everybody needs to be there at the table kind of grappling over what those trade-offs are and how we deal with them. In the meantime, we have to keep generating knowledge with experiments and data and all that kind of stuff. And those data ultimately feed into and drive these decision support tools. In the end, we like to think that by coupling these decision support tools and these transdisciplinary processes with real data, that we over time valorize or add value to healthy ecosystems, healthy agroecosystems, which are not any one particular type of ecosystem. It's probably a mosaic, but it's a mosaic that we think includes a lot more diversity and a lot more perenniality with respect to the plants that we grow. And so I'll just summarize by saying that we've shown, we as a nation have shown a tremendous capacity to change in the energy sector. The policy, the RFS policy drove tremendous change out on the landscape and in terms of supply chains with first generation biofuels. But it's not an overstatement to say that the creation of that has been devastating to our health. It's devastated our agricultural health, it's devastated our individual health, and it's devastated our community health. Second generation bioenergy, we think would be a net positive for society, but so far we haven't had the political courage to actually make it happen. And by political courage, I mean politicians who are willing to basically vote against their own best interest, because when they take these votes, they will get chopped. And that's just the way it is. And we can talk more about the politics of change there if you want. I think we must grow societal demand by raising public awareness and conversation about the importance of these issues and elevating so-called second generation bioenergy. We got to work to bring together community groups to rally. We've got to keep developing these decision support tools, and we've got to collaborate with these policymakers who are going to have to stick their necks out on the line, and we have to support them and help them take some risks. Because I really think ultimately, if we want to have cellulosic bioenergy, if we want second generation bioenergy, as I said at the beginning, it's a socio-ecological issue, and we're going to have to drive it with some pretty aggressive policy. Let me stop yammering and say that I'd be happy to take questions or have some open conversation if that's a possibility. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thanks, Randy. We do have a few questions in the Q&A, and I'll read those off, and please add some more questions as we're talking through these ones. So I think maybe jumping off your last couple points there, Melissa says, what's really eroded is our focus on the common good and the health of future generations. None of this information you shared is new, but how can politicians turn their back on big agribusiness who have such deep pockets? We can't make substantive change without changes in laws and policies.
Yes, how can they turn their backs? That's a great question, and that, without getting political, they have to be supported by the vote, and we have to get people in there who are willing to make that change. And that's only going to happen when there's a overwhelming mandate from the people to make that change. And it's going to be met with fierce resistance. It always is. It always has been. It'll be met with resistance like, this is anti-farmer. It'll be met with resistance like, we need to feed the world. How can we produce less when we need to feed the world? These tropes are tired and they've been discredited, and we just have to rally folks around Truth. Sorry, I don't have any scientific answer in that regard. We need a movement.
Another question that came in, has there been a link seen between the profitability of corn with soil loss? You showed those graphs of profitability. I don't know if that maybe year to year, if that.
That's a good question. I have not seen that sort of data set. What there has been very clearly demonstrated is a link between cheap food, cheap calories, in other words, the profitability of producing corn and other grains, and negative health outcomes, human health outcomes, and ecosystem health outcomes. There was a paper a couple of years ago by a group from UK named Benton. Anyway, the lead author's name is Benton. And the name of this paper, the title of this paper is The Paradox of Productivity. And basically it just shows that our focus on cheap calories is driving devastating health outcomes because it devalues the calories and it makes it easy for us to create cheap crap for us to eat and cheap crap to put in our gas tanks. And it makes it easy to waste calories as well because it's devalued.
And then question from Sandy, there might be a missing word. I'll see if I can paraphrase this. How can we better connect science and storytellers of corn ethanol, externality costs about devastated shrimping industries, blue-green algae, biodiversity, et cetera?
How can we connect them?
I think that's what there's.
Yeah.
I added that. I added the word connect because I'm not quite sure.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned this farmer-led watershed group. That's the Uplands watershed group in Southwest Wisconsin. And they've been really leading the charge in this effort in Southern Wisconsin, where they've had these reciprocal visits where they take farmers down to the Gulf and introduce them to the shrimpers and the fishers. They have fish boil down there and all that and build community. And then they invite them up and they meet at the farm up here and they have grass-fed beef and CSA vegetables, et cetera. But they are trying to build community at that bigger continental scale under the notion that people will be more likely to make good decisions when they feel like they're affecting their brethren rather than just, pushing that externality down the stream. And they've made great strides in terms of building community and building partnerships and that sort of thing. It remains to be seen whether we can actually get enough people involved to actually make that land use change that we need.
Guess I'll put a question out there as others are considering. Do you know much about sort of intercropping and the benefits or what the potential drawbacks are of mixing in kind of strips of grasslands in between traditional crops?
Yeah, well, the prairie strips work down in Iowa and it's now there are folks trying it up here in Wisconsin. I shouldn't say trying it, they're implementing it up here in Wisconsin and Minnesota, I think. Prairie strips is this idea that we can grow strips of diverse prairie in and among our annual cropping systems in order to slow down the soils, capture the soils that are running off, slow down nutrient loss, et cetera. And at least down to the Iowa site where they've done this now for almost 20 years, they've shown an amazing amount of soil and nutrient retention with only a relatively small amount of the area planted into prairie. Now, I think there's still some questions about, okay, like how long can that prairie actually act like a sponge and capture all that stuff as it comes off? At some point, does it need to be moved back up slope, if you will? I've always thought that should be the role of livestock, frankly, is to come in and harvest that biomass in the prairie and then move the nutrients in the soil back up slope somehow. So that shows great promise, and so much promise that Lisa Schulte-Moore, who's sort of heading that work up, was recently won a MacArthur Genius Award, which is pretty exciting for our community because it's really putting a spotlight on the importance of perenniality and diversity in agriculture. So I think it shows great promise. I frankly, I'm skeptical about only a small fraction of the land being in perennial grassland. I think we need, and this is the impetus behind this Grassland 2.0 project that I help lead. I think we need an agricultural system that is predominantly grassland. That's the matrix. That we then grow grains and other annual crops where we need them and when we need them for more local consumption. The main problem with our current agricultural system is that we treat it as a wealth generating enterprise. And that wealth generation is essentially extracting the soil energy, whether it's the carbon that was in the soil or the soil itself. And we just have to, it's just like coal. I mean, we have to move away from that. We can't keep doing it. Otherwise we undermine any chance for our grandchildren to live a good life.
All right, well, if no more questions come in the next few seconds, I think we'll wrap it up here. Thanks so much for your presentation, Professor Jackson, and yeah, great questions from our attendees as well. So in a couple of weeks, we'll be joined by actually a visiting professor, Katharina Brinkert, who is from the University of Warwick, who will be talking about artificial photosynthesis. So not even relying on plants necessarily to do the job. So
I'm all for it. I'm all for it. I got to get me some of that.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us, and have a great week.
Thanks, everybody.